So for those of you just joining, we're just going to wait another 2 minutes and then we'll get started here. Still lots of people joining the webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really excited to be participating in this first of what we hope to be many CIO interviews. So it's the CIO Interview Series for higher education during COVID-19. So I'm really excited to be kicking this off. Obviously, this was a relatively new idea since we've been in this COVID-19 era. And for today's first session, we have a great guest joining us, Reed Kissling, who is CIO of Western Seminary. In fact, I'll tell you a little bit more about Reed's background here in a moment, because he's much more than just the CIO of Western Seminary. And I've been really excited to hear some of Reed's ideas and talk to him a bit before this webinar, and I'm sure he's got some great things to share with everyone. So this is going to be hopefully a thought-provoking and engaging exchange, really focused on the kind of unique set of challenges that CIOs in higher education are facing at this moment. And we know that this is kind of one of those moments where you really want to reach out and know what colleagues in similar situations are doing and how they're dealing with this unique set of circumstances. So let me introduce Reed to you. So Dr. Reed Kissling, he's worked in higher education administration for the past 2 decades. He's got a very unique background. We'll talk about that here in a moment. He's got expertise in areas of technology architecture, strong leaning towards organizational culture and change. And what do you, I mean, now everybody obviously is starting to think, whether you are in the camp that thinks it's too early or not soon enough. Yeah. People are already starting to think about, somehow the crisis is changing and we're moving into the next phase. So is there a new set of projects or challenges? Do you have your own kind of opening plan at some point, or what does that look like?
Yeah, we don't have a specific opening plan yet. Our provost has said we're going to make the call on fall by July 1. And Oregon is kind of, it seems like it's a little bit more conservative compared to other states too. So we're a little bit of a unique situation in that we're graduate only. We don't have residence halls, so that didn't change how we operated in a lot of ways. And as an institution, we've been doing distance ed for 30 years, starting way back with sending VHS tapes in a box by mail. So we have a lot of students that we're doing online, and it was a matter of converting all the campus-based courses into remote delivery. So yeah, like just about everybody else, figuring out how do you use Zoom? How do we license Zoom? How many licenses do we need to purchase? And even going through the piece of, do we have one license and then that administrative user goes in and passes off the hosting to a faculty member? Do we give faculty members their own licenses? Things like that, just because it wasn't something that we had done before. So those were new pieces.
So speaking about that, let's talk about that, the tech stack that you work with. You mentioned a lot of Microsoft.
Hmm.
So and then Zoom. So there was which pieces of the technology puzzle did you suddenly have to go out and acquire? You mentioned
Right.
Microsoft, and the Microsoft suite suddenly became more important.
Yep.
So what did your stack look like, and what does it look like, and what do you think it'll look like going forward?
Yeah, we're intending to continue with Microsoft and use that for, we use Active Directory federated services for a lot of our single login. We are not at the single sign-on phase yet, but that's a plan in the future. One big thing for our ops guys was building out Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, and they've been messing around with it, but this actually they jumped into that and figured out how to do that for quickly deploying hardware, and that has been a big help and major time savings, particularly with people working remotely on our IT team, so they can easily put together hardware and deploy that much more quickly than they would before. A key piece for us, because we've got some legacy systems that were only accessible via VPN, we bumped up some of our network-based resources with RDS and gave remote access to those systems without the need for VPN, but making it still secure. So that was a boon for us. We had not planned on doing that, but that was something that we just kind of happened upon. So yeah.
So that mix of on what do you have on premise? The legacy systems, is that in a facility, or is that on actual on, what does on premise even mean to you?
Yeah, we've got a combination of things on-prem and cloud. We're using Amazon Cloud for primarily our LMS. We use Moodle a lot, again, a lot of open source stuff. And we have built a lot of connections back to our campus-based systems in the past years, including some pretty robust caching mechanisms. We still host our website on-prem, which is a bit unique. We've been having a lot of conversations about pushing that out, but hadn't done that yet because we do a lot of JavaScript pulling right out of our database for data that we display on the website, and that was one of those pieces that hadn't moved yet. Yeah, we still host our main ERP, I guess you would say. It's our own custom, and that is done in a Microsoft SQL environment, and so we host that ourselves too. The primary legacy thing that we have is, and we've been trying to dump this as fast as we can. We use an Access front end to our Microsoft SQL database, and so that has some severe limitations, including just how it was architected. So we have been moving over the last number of years to a web-based environment with PHP. So we're just trying to do that as quickly as we can also.
So if there was one system you could have had already moved or migrated before this crisis, what would it have been that you're like, oh, we should have done that earlier?
You know, because of the connections that we've had, it really didn't cause us too much of a problem. So it's just a matter of us thinking about this in the future for business continuity. We do want to move more stuff to cloud. Not to do just whole scale move everything, because I think we need to have a wise mix of those two. But one of the biggest things that was causing us to consider that in the past was we've had power outages on campus, and we've increased our UPSs and whatnot, but that was a major problem, because if your web goes down, we're dead in the water. Nobody knows what's happening. So
Right.
that's what we've been still talking about.
Right. All right. Well, shifting gears a little bit from just some of the more pragmatic and practical choices around tools. How do you think the higher education landscape evolves? Obviously, there's a lot of debate going on about that right now. Seems
Yeah.
like couldn't be a hotter topic. Is this is it going to change forever? Is this just a blip in the radar?
Right.
How do you see this towards going into the future?
Well, it's really interesting. I've been, as others have been, thinking about that. I saw a really interesting article. I guess it was Hechinger report yesterday. Read about changing attitudes, not necessarily changing attitudes of students related to online education, but faculty. And I think in many ways, what this has really done is destabilized current perspectives on remote delivery or online education that I think is going to change the dynamics of how we deliver education moving forward. So it will probably facilitate additional conversations with faculty that may have taken far longer because of just different perspectives. Whether it was thinking that online wasn't as good, or people were maybe a little bit afraid of it. Now that
Well,
they've had to do it, they've now had a little bit of different experience. So
and I think one of the issues that's always been talked about with online education is that it puts the power in the hands of the administration and takes it away from the faculty.
yeah,
Certainly with the massive online courses,
yeah.
that was kind of what always was being talked about. Do you think do you think administrations are thinking, wow, this is going to end up meaning that costs go down in the long run? I mean, it's a kind of a
uh,
dirty question, but it's been brought
well,
up before.
as our institution, having been doing distance ed for so long, the reality is if you're doing online or distance ed well, it doesn't cost any less.
Hmm.
And in fact, if you're probably doing online well, it may actually cost more in some cases. Um, I think what's happening in terms of the conversation with administration and faculty, there's been a move with online education to do a lot of asynchronous delivery of education because of this environment now, and doing more remote delivery. I think it's going to change the conversation about what's the mixture between synchronous and asynchronous. We had started that conversation institutionally, and it's basically brought that to the forefront. I think there's a strong desire now for students to gain additional, maybe the community feel through the synchronous environment, and that may actually uh, be transported even into fully online classes in some way. At least that's what the conversation going on at our institution. So
That's interesting. I love the question around synchronous versus asynchronous,
yeah,
and that has so many meanings across the
oh yeah,
technology spaces. So you're saying you think it moves back towards more synchronous via online?
I think it will. In many ways, I've seen a lot of online education that the pendulum has swung too far to the other direction,
Right.
where it was just video. There's been a lot of questions I've heard from other fellow faculty members about this is just a correspondence course, you know.
Yeah.
So it I think it can really foster good conversations about what kind of learning outcomes are we really trying to achieve with our students, and can this help us do this in a more effective way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In fact, we were at ProcessMaker. We have been talking about this a lot lately with reference to our own training. Right, we give training
Sure.
in our solution, and in some sense, we said, well, why isn't everything just log into the portal, watch your videos, take your tests, and get your certification? And I looked at our agenda and our schedule, and we were doing a lot of live online, and I was asking the question to our training team, well, if we're repeating that, if it's very similar each time, why wouldn't you just record it? But they didn't like that idea. They really felt there's something nuanced about a live conversation, right? We're having a
Hmm.
live conversation right now, so at any moment my
Hmm.
kids could burst through this door and wreak havoc on it.
Yeah.
And so I mean, it's like movies versus theater, or any of these kind of arguments. So I
Yeah.
think that's interesting that you think it might actually, since it's forced people to give their live courses online, that maybe people will sort of say, hey, it's actually, that doesn't necessarily need to be adjusted.
Yeah, and I think some of it is, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, because if you're simply conveying knowledge and maybe skills, that makes sense. But I think a lot of what we're trying to do is really get at affect. How do we change people's perspectives? And that happens. It's a relational component, and so doing that in a live way, I think, really fosters the kind of education. Certainly for us as a seminary, we're really thinking about character formation, and there's been a lot of dialogue, even academically, over the last number of years about, can you do character formation in an online environment? And I think the answer is yes, if you are intentional, but really being intentional about the elements that you incorporate, and potentially doing synchronous conversations with others. So I personally, I did doctoral studies it was one of the first online PhD programs. We started in a residency with a cohort for about a week and a half, and then we moved to online, and it enriched the kind of online conversations because we knew who we were talking with. So
Yeah.
that's just an example of how that just changes the dynamic a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's true across business. When you can
Yeah,
carry on a virtual live or even asynchronous conversation with somebody if you've met them before.
yeah,
It's you're going to have much less issues of communication. Whereas if you haven't, then it gets much more challenging. Um,
right.
Even though we're taking questions at the end, there's a point here in the panel from or in the Q&A from Christopher Graham, and I think he had it as an interesting point. He said, "I've heard students who have doubled down on their dislike and manifesting it in the form of, if my school goes online in the fall, I'm taking the semester off."
Yeah,
It's kind of another question around just the future and financing and what's going to happen in the fall, but
hmm,
I guess it does sort of, I mean, this experiential education, there's an amount you're paying to go for your education, and part of it is the experiential part, and that's the part of the formative part as well.
right.
So, I mean, I think, is there some pricing consideration there? And two, do you think that will kind of have that result, like just a lot of people just saying, well, I'm going to look for education elsewhere?
I think it really depends on the mission of the institution, and how in some ways, just like any other kind of relationship, it's the expectations of the person who is, quote unquote, purchasing the education. We're also in a really unique situation. Is just reporting to our president yesterday that our summer enrollment actually increased. So, and honestly, cause and effect, we don't know exactly why, but it's increased significantly compared to what it was in the past. I don't know if it's because people are now available, they have flexible schedules, and they can pursue more classes, but it hasn't deterred students from doing that at our institution. And obviously, we haven't begun registration for fall or finalized fall plans. But I think it just depends on the expectation of the student base. So with an undergrad population that really has high expectations for that campus-based experience, that may very well be the case. And it's
Do you
really
think?
hard to replace that.
Right. Do you think it's fair to say? I mean, higher education has always been counter-cyclical, always does well in recessions.
Yeah,
This is anything but a typical recession. Recession happens to be happening, but we're also in the midst of this, pandemic, right? So you can't get
right,
close to people. So it does seem like education, if you look at the recessionary piece, it's going to have to benefit, but maybe not traditional education. So it might be some of these, like you say, graduate studies, maybe more mission driven types of education, or there's going to be certain pockets, which I imagine, just like in the rest of the economy, are going to really benefit because education should be benefiting.
right. Yeah, I think it's because this is so new, the jury's still out on it to see what is this. And ultimately, education, it is the student experience. They are purchasing something. But they are saying, I want to be changed into something else by the time I'm done, and they have to agree that them spending the dollars that they're going to spend is going to accomplish that. So to the degree that we can, as higher education institutions, deliver on that value proposition, I think they'll still continue to purchase it if they're able. But that remains to be seen.
Right. Going back a little bit to the technology side of things,
Yeah.
you know, obviously Zoom and video conferencing and have become big in this moment. But what other technologies, I guess, now you thought of or going forward, do you think these are going to be really important? And again, you mentioned that the Microsoft Suite, but maybe you can dive a little bit back into what other.
Yeah. Well, I guess I think, well, for one thing, video conferencing is here to stay. I think that's pretty clear. What exactly that looks like, I don't know. It just depends. Again, some of that, the synchronous and asynchronous elements. It seems like learning management systems are going to have to figure out how to incorporate that more effectively to accomplish what faculty are trying to accomplish. And there's been a lot of growth in that in the last number of years. So it may simply be faculty learning how to effectively incorporate that into their environment. I think this obviously moving things to a cloud-based environment is going to be another continuing conversation for institutions. And then one of the questions is that I'm asking, even as a CIO, and pertaining to security and access to network resources, how much do we really need accessible via our VPN? Do we need everything there? What can we do in different ways? Can we migrate things to a cloud-based storage and retrieval? So some of those are good long-standing questions for us to ask, and just to really think about it within higher education in general.
What about Reed? What about at the sort of departmental level, the faculty and administration? How have things changed with the way you're interacting with them? So, leaving
Sure.
aside the students for a moment, I guess operators of the institution, and what?
Yeah. I guess one of the things, well, in particular, because of my vantage point, I oversee institutional effectiveness and assessment as well at our institution, and I think we're talking a lot more about even business process reengineering. How do we map processes more effectively? I think one of the things from one of the things from the perspective of student service is, because it's one thing to deliver the education, but what about all the other services that are necessary in order to be effective? And I think it's going to cause us to ask a lot more questions about, are our processes clear and can they be more effective? Those are the kind of conversations we're starting to have institutionally about how do we continue to serve students in this kind of an environment.
And in terms of having that kind of clarity, do you think it just results in more things? I mean, the lack of clarity shows up in just more miscommunication. I mean, obviously, you're a guy who's kind of studied a lot about empathy in the organization, and that, as you mentioned, that's tough. And as an institution that's trying to form character, you realize how tough that is to do virtually. But same as for an organization, it's tough to kind of do that, have that kind of softer side, the empathy side stand out. That's important for a high functioning organization.
Absolutely. Well, communication is essential. In almost every case, when you have problems within an organization, it stems to some kind of a communication problem. There's an old saying in preaching, I'll give because of my context, which is, mist in the pulpit is fog in the pew. So if the leader up front is unclear, everybody else who's listening to the leader is not going to have an idea about what's happening. And that seems to be transpiring. If we are unclear on our teams as we're trying to serve students well, students aren't going to have an idea. If we're unclear in terms of delivering services to faculty, then they're going to be unclear, and the students are not going to know what's next. So it does necessitate increased communication. That's one thing that I have experienced even in the last 4 or 5 weeks. Many more meetings. You see that you may have seen articles on just why are we so tired because of Zoom, things like that. But I think in many ways it's caused some really good conversations for us to have internally about how do we get on the same page? Are we on the same page? Just really setting consistent direction together. And so this challenge, even though it's a challenge, in many ways is also an opportunity for our institutions to do things differently.
Right, right. So with respect to the fog, we should not inject bleach. Is what
No. Yeah. Yeah, I won't go on any of the political conversations related to that.
I just couldn't resist that. So talking again about the students and their adjustment going forward, at your school, students have, if they're missing a calendar, they're missing hardware. You mentioned they got the hardware. How do you hear, what do you see in other institutions, and what do you think is the biggest adjustment for students, both from the academic perspective and then also just from the personal and social perspective?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of articles that are being posted in various different forums on access to higher education and students who have challenges to continued access to education based on their environment. Maybe it's students who come from a low-income background. They may have a reasonable place to stay at home, but do they have access to all the services? Even faculty, if I've got all my kids around, can I actually do my job?
Right.
So those are just great questions for us to ask. What does a reasonable environment look like for us to create, and what's necessary? Many institutions I've seen have that kind of question that happens at the admissions process for somebody who's pursuing a fully online program. Do you have the bandwidth that you need? Do you have the kind of computer hardware and software that you need? I think it's going to cause us to ask that question of a broader swath of our students than we ever have in the past, because it seems like this is going to force us to move towards more hybrid education in some ways, because it makes it more accessible in some instances, but it does have technology challenges. So those are not insurmountable, though. But the human elements can bring some other challenges that I think we're going to have to think creatively about how to address those.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, we keep hearing in the news that there's so many things happening, and we won't know the repercussions of those for years, maybe even decades. Look back and think that this all me going forward. And I think there's also so many interrelated things going on in institutions. So there's a lot more questions we'll have to ask of students to understand what their situation really is. So, previously we could make assumptions. And I think on the mental health front, there's a lot of interrelated questions. And so I think your point is well taken. I was speaking to an institution earlier this morning about various aspects of their mental health strategy, where they now feel they need to just get more communication because all of these things are now, the economic impacts are affecting the mental and social, and they weren't really taking that into consideration before.
Definitely. Well, I think another piece to this too is I will often reference, there was a set of guidelines that was created by WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, on creating effective online student services. And interestingly enough, they created that set of guidelines in 2002. So nearly 2 decades ago. Unfortunately, I find the vast majority of institutions would not um, characterize their student services as effective online student services.
Mm.
Um, in many ways, we had a move, 4 decades ago to create one-stop shops for students in a physical environment. Um, I liken that in many ways to telephone registration. We're so familiar with going from kind of arena registration to telephone registration, and most institutions kind of leapfrog telephone registration and move to online.
Right.
Um, in many ways, we created these one-stop shops that are kind of like telephone registration. We haven't leapfrogged or moved to the next phase, which is effective online services. And in an instance like this, where that's the only means to access the services at the institution, we really have to think about that more effectively. But
Mm.
that is going to demand data integration across all of our systems. The fact that we have people who are aware of a student's voice or profile across all these different systems. Um, I, I, we've seen instances at institutions where uh, the student will have a conversation with one person and another person who needs to know that information doesn't know it. In many ways, it's kind of the equivalent of 9/11 across all of our
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, all the different information gathering sources that we had in our country. We're kind of facing that in a microcosm now.
And Reed, that's interesting. Again, this conversation we had this morning with an institution around how to better connect some of their mental health related services, wellness services. One of the issues was, of course, they all had their own sets of information. And one of the reasons for that was privacy.
Right.
And when we suggested kind of singular intake and more intelligent suggesting of what services a student might need because they might be related, we got into the age old question of, well, then we're going to have an issue with privacy because this group over here doesn't necessarily have a right or shouldn't know what's in my particular student case management system.
Right. Well, and that's not an issue of the technology. That's all the stuff surrounding how we set the technology up with access management and control. Do we have do we trust one another, for one thing? And obviously that's a much more challenging conversation at larger institutions,
Right.
because we have to agree with the intent of the use of that information and be really clear about it, and maybe review that on a much more regular basis than we do. So yeah, that is
Right.
really important. And I think it comes back to that singular focus on how do we benefit the student most. So we tend to devolve into our own perspectives on here's how I serve the student most effective. But I think we need to kind of take a step back and have a broader viewpoint of that in order to do that effectively.
Right. Right. Well, I've got just a couple more questions here for you. In the meantime, anyone who does want to ask something or suggest something, please do put it in the Q&A. So Reed, another question here. Prior to this COVID-19 crisis, crises are always the moment of formation for leaders. It's the
Mm.
real place where people look back and say, "Wow, that was a true leadership moment." For you, what was the most challenging kind of leadership challenge you had prior to this?
Mm.
Has this been the biggest so far in your career, or if not, what was?
Well, certainly in some ways the answer is yeah, because it was it has been so different than what we expected, and we had to pivot very quickly. So that has been probably the biggest challenge in that sense. I think, however, probably the biggest challenge prior to this was, in many ways, I think, for those of us in the technology side, it's almost seen like the technology is an evil that we must deal with at our institutions. And some of this comes back to the conversation about even how do we effectively engage with faculty who may have a negative view of remote instruction or online instruction. So what is an appropriate use of technology, and making sure that this is a key part of our conversation. Brian, I think in a prior conversation I mentioned that I'd made a comment to our board at our institution in our January meeting that we essentially operate like a technology company that happens to do higher ed. And when I made that comment, there were a few kind of snickers, like, yeah, right, whatever. Well, in many ways, this crisis has demonstrated that we cannot do what we do in higher ed without technology. It's not possible. What we need to figure out is what is the role of technology and how do we invest in it appropriately. At our most recent board meeting, I brought up the fact that there's this concept in programming called technical debt, and try to pay down technical debt. And in many ways, it's the equivalent of deferred maintenance on the physical structures. We as institutions need to start thinking about how do we invest in the technology in order to do what we need to do, and that it becomes just as an important investment as any of the physical structures. In this recent challenge that we're dealing with right now, that's the case, because our physical structures don't matter right now to a great degree, but the technology does. So what does this look like moving forward, and how do we do those in balance? I think is going to be a great conversation for us to have for years to come. Yeah,
no, I think that is a really good point. I actually live just less than a half a mile from one of a big set of empty structures. So I'm in Durham, North Carolina, right off of the Duke University campus, and of course, beautiful campus, but completely empty right now, like every other campus. Well, Reed, I'd love to get to some of the questions now.
Sure.
So I'm just going to jump in a couple of these that look interesting. So this is from Abdel Ali, a question about so his question is, how do you use the data that's entered into different workflows via a reporting solution such as Power BI or QuickView? So just to give that a little more context, I do think reporting is interesting. It came up in my conversation this morning with regards to, how are different parts of the student population encountering either economic problems or mental problems or whatever it may be. And part of the problem is a data problem. Like, how can you cross data effectively? So what sort of tools do you have? How sophisticated are most institutions with their use of data warehousing and sort of advanced data reporting and analytics?
Well, I think that's a huge issue. Now with more recent tools, I think we have a lot of systems that have data that's accessible via API. Quite honestly, the challenge is when you say API and you ask the question, companies say, yeah, we've got an API, and it's like we can access our user profile, and that's about it. None of the other data. More and more companies are starting to expose that data so that we can use it effectively and use it across systems and do the data integration that way. Previously, it was really challenging. I'll reference a process that happened. So in the last couple of years, ACRO as an organization worked with the Lumina Foundation and NASPA, which is another national association, on what was called a comprehensive learner record, extending the transcript beyond the typical courses and grades for other kinds of learning that students experience. And one of the things that was readily apparent at the beginning of that process, when they started talking about ingesting all this information from all these data systems, is that we don't have a good means of integrating the data across all these disparate systems. And that had to be addressed first. So that report, there's a white paper that they did. You can access that on the ACRO website under the Comprehensive Learner Record information. You might be interested in looking at that and some of the recommendations from other key technology leaders on how to engage that integration conversation across your campus.
Great. Let's take two more questions here. Reed, question came in from Heather Schellebarger. How are you handling phone calls to staff from students and prospective students?
Oh, great question.
Yeah.
That is a really good question. Well, one of the things that we started doing is investigating moving our phones. We have VoIP phones, and so which is fortunate, but it's really challenging because they have to be powered, and most people don't have a power over Ethernet switch at home. So because we're a smaller institution, we resorted to using personal devices. One of the things that we are also strongly investigating is moving things over to a different system, even answering phones through Microsoft Teams. We're digging into that system. Microsoft has a ability for you to transfer the SIP over to their system and then use it to answer over the other device. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. It's not cheap, but they have also some potential options for that too. So
got it. Another question here. This is from Joshua Goodman. How are you taking in and measuring feedback from students and faculty when it comes to the end user experience and challenges that they're having with learning, teaching, and working remote? My father works as a professor at a school, and the experience surely varies vastly from individual to individual and role to role.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of this from a kind of an assessment perspective and even institutional research, if you're at a higher ed institution, I would encourage you to reach out to the institutional research office and ask them what they're doing. We've had those conversations, particularly trying to create focus groups around engaging with students to get their feedback, as well as faculty to get their feedback. So we opted for the focus group opportunity because just sending out a survey is going to get limited participation, and focus groups offer the ability to get a lot of complex and nuanced information that you wouldn't otherwise get in just a quantitative survey. So that's one of the things that we've been trying to do and get individual feedback. And then when our advisors are interacting with students, they're asking specific questions as well. So we're trying to ingest all that into our process, but a lot of qualitative data.
I think we have time for a few more here. By the way, Doria Hardy mentioned something that's interesting for the phone question. She said, our institution enabled the phone via MS Teams.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of probably creative solutions on the phone side.
Yeah, we looked at that, and the base rate for Microsoft is like $20 per phone per month. So we're looking at some other options to see, do we really have to pay that? But it may make sense for us if we're going to continue in a remote environment long term. So
right. Here's a question from Mike Wellham. This is an interesting one that I've seen in our environment, just in software in general. He says, I've seen a surprising change in phishing, scam, security issue emails, and targeted attacks taking advantage of COVID-19, made worse by people being at home on personal equipment. Have you been affected? And if so, how are you minimizing this risk?
Yeah, fortunately, we haven't had that much in comparison. And part of that is, I think, probably due to the size of our institution. We're less than 800 students, so in less breadth. But we have seen some, and that's one of the things that we're talking about. Our IT team is really focused on how do they address that and try to target some of those pieces. We're also looking at some additional training, like license sequencing know before, and doing some things like that. So those are some pieces that we're probably going to add here very soon.
Here's another question. I think this is an interesting one from Mike Anderson. So for business process improvement, so for this idea of we've got processes we now need to change, do you have any lessons learned from the CIO perspective, such as partnering with campus entities or bringing in specialists and getting time estimates on what it takes to change those processes?
Oh my, yeah. Well, I could do a whole webinar just on that. Actually, I kind of do some workshops on business process improvement and whatnot. We've gone through that process quite a bit more recently, creating a small team that would help to learn how to do process mapping and then help others think through that. We started by training just a few people on how to use Visio because we have access to it, building out some of those flow charts, and then going through how do you map the way it is currently, because if you don't map the way it is currently, you miss pieces, and then shift over to what should it look like as we make improvements over time. One of the things that I think is an untapped resource at a lot of institutions is talking with business faculty. They may have experience doing this in other contexts, or organizational design faculty, depending on the nature of your institution. This is probably a great opportunity to just look across the institution to see, does anybody have experience doing this, and could they help start these efforts? But there's also, as I mentioned, we'll do workshops on it through ACRO and various different things like that as well. So
great. Well, we also have a request here for at some point in the future to do a webinar that talks more about using MSFT Teams and VPN, as you alluded to. I know that probably is a challenge, again, this mix of legacy systems and cloud systems.
Yeah.
We won't go into that today, but I think that is obviously that's kind of a challenge, and probably one that's giving a lot more impulse to cloud in general.
Yeah. Well, and I will say that one of the things that we're using in terms of some of our tools, we had opted, so task and communication and project management, we opted to go with Basecamp a couple of years ago, and this essentially put that into overdrive to make our entire team use that. So we use a combination of Microsoft Teams and Basecamp, and it's been interesting in our workflow to talk amongst our team about when do we use each of the tools. So probably one of the biggest recommendations that I could give is whenever you adopt a tool, try and be really clear about the intention and the proposed use of that tool. When should it be used? How should it be used? Are we storing documents there? Are we storing them somewhere else? Otherwise, it's just a free-for-all. And again, it becomes then a communication problem. So we've had to work through that, but we're at a pretty good place now. And I'd say in many ways, we're actually more productive than we were before because we had to clarify these communication pieces.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, a good point to end on. I think I can't emphasize that enough. We use Basecamp internally as well, and it really does boil down to the best tool for, most tools now have some set of always have a set of feature overlap with other tools, right. And the marketing can be really confusing. So this one says it does process and documents and collaboration. Yeah. But are you really going to do all three in that tool? Is it best for all three? So I think that's something that I think the CIO really does need to help the institution kind of work through, because there's a lot of tools, and each one can do usually a few things well, but not everything.
Sure, you bet.
Well, with that, Reed, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been great questions.
My pleasure.
From everybody attending, and I hope everybody else benefited as much as I did. I really enjoyed it. And again, we look forward to continuing. We're going to have some other CIOs on this series, and we will let everybody know in the near future. So again, Reed, thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Brian. It was really my pleasure to join you, and I look forward to joining others. Great. We'll hope to see you in person soon. Sounds good. Thanks, Reed. Bye, everyone.